Perfect. So I need to click that. All right, so as Hara mentioned, today I will focus my talk on the probabilistic buckling of imperfect shells, and I'm gonna talk about a different concept. So for example, usually in the literature, we were focusing on shells with one very well defined imperfection at the pole. So the idea of my talk is that we are now focusing on shells with multiple imperfections, and specifically distributions of imperfections, as I will explain later on during the talk. So before I enter like this probabilistic buckling idea, I want to give a little bit of an overview of what I have worked on during my academic path. So as Hara mentioned, I obtained my diploma in Aristotle University of Thessaloniki, where I was focusing mainly in finite element modeling, and specifically I was part of the team that we were developing the graphical environment of the open source software OpenSeas for earthquake engineering. Then I moved at UMass, where I have focused in different topics, but my dissertation was mainly split in two parts. One, it was coliform steel shear walls under earthquake events, fully structural engineering. And the second part had to do with the stability and actually the imperfection sensitivity of plate lattice architected materials. And then now I am at EPFL with Pedro, and I'm focusing on different umbrellas, we call them. One of them is the shell buckling that I'm going to give a lot of information about. Then there is this rod tangling that we are working on as a group, that actually I'm exploring the dynamics of fibers subjected to two-directional rotation, and I'm checking about knot formations. And then I'm doing lots of X-ray microcomputed tomography, also in bioengineering a bit. We're collaborating with biologists in the topology and the brain of fruit flies. But yeah, I will start immediately introducing the shell buckling problem. All right, why is this important? Why do we care about buckling of shells? Because buckling is a failure that it can be very brittle, and when it happens, it can be very catastrophic, as we could see here in this video of this railroad tank. So it's very critical that we can predict this buckling load of shells, and specifically in this talk, I'm focusing on spherical shells. And this is quite relevant because we could have spherical shells along different scales, from the micrometers, like the microcapsules here, all the way to the huge liquid storage tanks. So it becomes very important. And a very important concept in shell buckling, and specifically in general, in cylindrical and spherical shell buckling, is the concept of imperfection sensitivity, because these shells are highly imperfection sensitive, and a measure of imperfection sensitivity is called the knockdown factor, which is the ratio of the maximum buckling pressure that we can obtain experimentally or with finite element modeling over the theoretical buckling pressure of a perfect shell, which is given by this equation in the early 90s. So this concept, I'm going to be using it throughout the whole presentation, and it shows the buckling strength and the imperfection sensitivity of the shells. Now, to show you the importance of imperfections, there is this work by Carlson in 1967 on metallic balls with many imperfections, and then he has shown that by chemically removing imperfections, we could be actually able to increase the knockdown factor of the shells quite a lot. I want to mention here that the knockdown factor equal to 1 means that we have a perfect shell, so the capacity is the maximum we could get, while below 1, it means that sensitivities imperfections play a role, and the shell is quite sensitive to these imperfections. Now, in our lab, a little bit of a literature review, Anna has developed this fabrication technique where we are having a mold to create hemispherical shells by pouring polymer into it. And then after 20 minutes of curing, we are actually able to obtain a shell that is quite homogeneous in thickness. And also a follow-up study from Anna and the group showed that they are also able to fabricate shells with one very well-defined imperfection at the pole, both experimentally and in finite element modeling. And there are a lot of works focusing on shells with one imperfection. Now, one follow-up work that I'm involved as well, and it's recently published, is actually focusing indeed on shells with one imperfection, but instead of having this Gaussian dipole dimple, that is the most common imperfection in the literature, we are also introducing bumps. So we're talking about outward deformation or inward. This is dimple, this is bump. And we found actually that the knockdown factor of shells with bumps is always higher than the knockdown factor of shells with dimples. And this also had to do with the failure mechanism. For example, for dimple shells, when we have a shell with one dimple in the middle, we expect it to fail exactly at the location of the imperfection we introduce, while when we have bumps, we could see that there are different failure modes depending on the amplitudes of our imperfections. But once again, we are talking about shells with one defect. And my goal now, and my focus now as a postdoc, is to create methods, experimental finite element and finite element methods, to predict the imperfection sensitivity of shells with more than one defect. So we start with two defects, and then we ask ourselves, how do these defects interact? And if they interact, and if so, how does this affect the shell buckling? Then we move towards shells with distribution of defects, and this is the main part of the work, where we are actually introducing a fabrication technique of shells with many defects, and also we validate the three-dimensional finite element model. And then the main part of this work actually focus on the statistics of these shells. So we are focusing on the probabilistic buckling of these shells, and we ask ourselves the question, how can we relate the input statistics of the defects to the output statistics of the knockdown factor, and if we can relate them. All right, so step by step, I'm going to start with two imperfections, and I will define a little bit the variables because there are a lot of Greek letters happening in these presentations. So yeah, we define three of them that I will keep using throughout this whole presentation. So we have a shell, we have a dimple. The amplitude is denoted as delta. And then we normalize it by the thickness. And this is when I'm talking about amplitude throughout the presentation, I'm talking about the normalized version of it. When I'm talking about width, I'm going to talk about lambda. It's a normalized version as well of the angular width of the defects. And then we have phi, which is the angular separation center to center between the two defects. All right, and then after our analysis, I'm plotting here knockdown factor versus the angular separation, and we actually saw an interesting and different non-monotonic behavior happening as we increase the angular separation between defects. As we could see, the knockdown factor is decreased, then increased, and then it reaches a plateau. What does this mean? So this means that when the defects are very close to each other, so we are in this pink shaded area, we can actually obtain stronger or weaker shells, while when the defects do not interact, the strongest or the deepest defect is the one that really governs the behavior of the whole shell. And yeah, we also tested that by plotting on top of these curves the one defect case, and we saw indeed that in the plateau, the most critical defect is the one that governs the behavior. And actually, I have a lot of more details about the interactions between defects because it becomes important, and I'm gonna focus more on interactions at the end of my presentation because now I wanna talk about the statistics first. But there is two messages to get from here, is that once I'm gonna talk about the statistics, I'm gonna pick an angle within the interaction regime and an angle outside of the interaction regime and do some comparison. All right, so as I promised, first we're talking about experiments. So what we're doing, now we are 3D printing a mold with multiple distributions of imperfections. We pour polymer, after 20 minutes we are getting our shell with the multiple inherent defects. Then we go to the lab, we test those shells with this setup that I show here. So we have this syringe pump that is connected to our shell, and then we depressurize our shell and we measure the buckling pressure, the maximum buckling pressure that exists. We repeat every experiment 10 times, I have to say, because we want to obtain some standard deviation and see if the experiments are repeatable. And then once we test our experiments 10 times each, our specimens 10 times each, we go and we do some X-ray microcomputed tomography for two reasons. One, we want to obtain the full geometric profile of the shells, as well as the full thickness profile on the left side of the slide, in order to be able to validate our finite element model very, very accurately. And actually, this is here the validation that I show you. So knockdown factor versus some different shell geometries that I show you here. And as you can see, for the validation purposes, I'm varying a lot the amplitude, the width of the defects, the minimum angular separation between defects. So I vary a lot of parameters. And we are actually able to have a very good agreement between experiments and finite element modeling, always within 2% of error, like the maximum error is always less than 2%. So now we have a model that we trust, and all the results that I'm going to show you from now on are statistics based on finite element modeling in Abacus. All right, here are some basic modeling parameters. We can discuss maybe after the presentation if you want about specific modeling assumptions that we have made. But the idea here is the following. We have our shells. We keep constant the width of the defects for these simulations. And we vary the amplitude. So the random variable that I'm going to introduce is the amplitude. Also, I'm doing 1,200 simulations per shell in order to get a lot of statistics later on. So the method is the following. I introduce every defect individually, which follows a power law-like behavior, and it is sampled from a log normal distribution with a mean and a standard deviation. And then we fill the whole shell, of course, based on some constraints that we can define, like minimum angular separation, no overlap, no defects in the boundary, so we avoid boundary effects. And then we fill our shells with defects sampled from a log normal distribution in terms of amplitude. And then the hypothesis we had is that can we fit a weighable distribution in the output statistics, in the output knockdown factor? Here I'm plotting the PDF versus the knockdown factor, and I could see that I could fit a 3-parameter weighable distribution in my data. And to give a little bit of background of the 3-parameter weighable distribution, so the parameters that exist in that, here is the PDF, is the shape and the scale parameter, which is pretty similar for the 2-parameter weighable distribution. But a very critical point for our data was the threshold parameter, which is defined as kappa min. Kappa min is the minimum knockdown factor that we could get from the single defect curves, because we know that the knockdown factor that does not have such a big probability to go below this threshold value. And then to explore a little bit better the statistics of the knockdown factor that we are obtaining, we also plot the CDF. And if we focus on towards the left side of the slide, you're right, actually, if we plot the log of the CDF versus the log of the knockdown factor, we could actually see that all the data fall in one line, which is a strong indication that, yes, we can really describe our data by this 3-parameter weighable distribution. And that was important because until now, we didn't know that we can treat shell backlink as a probabilistic phenomenon. And now it gives access to the theorists to do like more theoretical models based on the weakest link model and extreme value statistics problems. So that was one of the main findings that we have from this work. And now, step by step, I'm going to give you a little bit of more information on what's happening to the statistics and to some to the knockdown factor and the probability density functions if we vary systematically some parameters. And we start from the case that defects do not interact. So the angular separation is quite big, so the defects are quite independent. We keep constant the mean amplitude and we change the standard deviation. So in this case, we have a pretty constant knockdown factor and pretty narrow PDFs. While when defects interact, so very small angular separation, we see that the PDFs are wider when we than the non-interacting defects. And also when we increase the standard deviation, we see that we decrease the knockdown factor. So this can be explained from the fact that now we have like a small amplitude with high standard deviation, so we have higher chance to sample from the tails, which will alter our results and actually decrease the knockdown factor. And pretty similar trends are happening if we keep constant the standard deviation and vary systematically the amplitudes of the defects, that we have much more narrower curves here in comparison to the PDFs when defects interact. And as a bigger summary, where I summarize all the parameters that we have examined here, is this plots. And again, I go step by step. Non-interacting defect case, I plot the knockdown factor, and what we call the mode is the peak of the PDFs, actually, versus the defect amplitude. And it is important to compare this with the one defect case. And we could see, for example, that my data fall exactly on top of the one defect case when they do not interact. So once again, even though we have around 80 defects in that case in our shell, the strongest is the one that governs the whole behavior of the shell. While when the defects interact, even though once again we have many defects, we see that the one defect curve, it's not really falling on top of the data. So some interactions are happening there, increasing or decreasing the knockdown factor. And then we wanted to test this once again with increasing the width of the defects now. We randomly sample based on the amplitude once again, but now wider defects, and we could see that when they do not interact, once again, we are on top of the single defect curve, and then there is higher discrepancies when defects interact. So this is, my first actually work that we published during my postdoc with Pedro. But then we had this question. I'm talking all the time about interactions and how do they affect and they become important. Although the point of this paper and the main target was for us to be able to talk about statistics, now we zoom out and we are going to talk a little bit more about interactions and how do they affect, and we can actually more systematically examine them and explore them. To do that, we went back to the two defect case right now to be able to really examine this. So the parameters are the same. I put them here as a reminder. One thing to mention is that in these cases, always the defect number 1 that you will see later on in the slides is in the pole. And then we change the angular separation and a lot of more of parameters of the second defect that it's not in the pole. Okay, and at this point, geometry becomes important as well. So I plotted actually the geometric profiles of some different shells. Lambda, once again, is the width. So we vary the width, and we can obtain some more information about this happening. For example, you could see that we start by having 2 defects for smaller lambda in this specific angular separation. But then if the defects are quite wide, we see that now the shell is quite distorted, and instead of having 2 defects, we have like 1 bigger dimple. And this becomes important later on in the results to understand why the trends are a little bit different. And something else that we need to keep also in mind is that same thing happening if we keep the width the same and we change the angular separation. So when the defects are very close to each other, they might form 1 bigger dimple imperfection. Then when we put them a little bit further away, you see that the edges are overlapping and interact, creating like an intermediate kind of bump. And then when they are very far away from each other, they are totally independent. And these are observations fully geometrical to keep in mind later on for the explanation and interpretation of the results. All right, so we started by having identical defects now. Are the radius, and we explore and we vary the thickness. And what we see is that in all of the cases, we have this non-monotonic behavior where we have weakening, strengthening, and then plateau. But as we increase the slenderness ratio, which means that our shells are thinner, the interaction regime is shifted a little bit towards the left, like this peak, the beginning of the plateau, actually, the onset of the plateau is a little bit shifted. And then we're like, oh, this is interesting, actually, because now we might think that we can relate this behavior to a characteristic length scale from the theory that I'm going to explain later on, that it involves only R and T. Also, in order to explain a little bit the deformed shapes here, is like when we have lower knockdown factor is where the defects interact very much and they form a single defect, a single dimple when they buckle. Then during the peak, we see that the edges only interact, which make the buckling mode to be a little bit delayed. That's why we have higher knockdown factor. And then in the plateau, they are totally independent. And then pretty similar observations are happening for different defects. In this case, once again, we see that the curves are non-monotonic, but shifted towards the right for you when we increase the slenderness ratio. All right, so this gives us some hint that we should talk maybe about some length scale, what we call right now separation arc length. Instead of plotting the angular separation rho, I converted it to the arc length. And now I'm examining some parameters in order to have a full picture on what's happening. So knockdown factor versus this arc length for different amplitudes. What we could see here is that we have pretty much similar onset of plateau for all the curves. So it's not such a critical parameter that defines the plateau when we change the amplitude, as we could see. When we change the width, though, so knockdown factor versus arc length for different widths, we see that we have, again, this non-monotonic behavior, but the trend's now changing a little bit more, and the knockdown factor is quite reduced. And then we see that the plateau is a little bit shifted for very wide defects, which once again, if we remember, very wide defects totally overlap and they form one single defect. So we expect this behavior to be a little bit different than the others. And now I plot on top of these graphs what we call the theoretical critical backlink wavelength in the literature. So this is an equation coming from Hutchinson in 1967, and it involves only, as I was telling you before, the square root of r multiplied by t, and then the material properties. So this is the critical backlink wavelength, which is related. It's computed based on the stretching and bending, the interplay of stretching and bending. And then I could see, if I plot this on top of my data, they are actually, it's pretty much related to where the plateau starts. And this is where we were like, oh, maybe that is very interesting for us. And this theoretical wavelength is actually what defines the initiation of the plateau. So now I replot the data that I showed you in these two slides that I showed you earlier. And maybe I can go a little bit slower here. So there is the knockdown factor versus the normalized arc length now. So this is the arc length that I showed you before, normalized by the theoretical value. And then you see we change vertically the amplitude. But the most important thing to notice here is that all the data collapse for the different slenderness ratios that they were shifted before. Once we normalize it, they are all collapsing. And this is very important to see that is happening also when we change the width. So that was one very important finding to see that indeed this theoretical critical backlink wavelength plays a role in our results. And also the gray areas, just for us to understand a little bit better, is where the defects overlap. I just highlighted it to show that here we have something like one dimple imperfection, while then it's like two mostly more independent two defects. Okay, now the critical point, and what we want to do is that, okay, this length scale plays a role. How can we actually, from our data, clearly define the onset of the plateau? Because we say that there is some area where defects interact, and beyond that, the defects are independent. So we did that by doing a 10% cutoff. So in the curves that I showed you earlier, we are going to have 10% from the maximum knockdown factor minus the plateau. And this is where I will define the threshold value in my data. So we're going to have a threshold value for the knockdown factor, which is going to be related to an angular separation. And then we have two definitions here. Throughout the whole presentation, I'm using the angle phi, which is center to center distance. But we have seen that because they overlap, the edges of the defects might play a role, strengthening or weakening the shell. So then we want to exclude portions of the defect, let's say, on how we define this arc length. And then here what we obtain. This is the threshold arc length definition of ours, LP or LP star. I'm plotting everything so we can really see the whole picture here, versus the theoretical backlink wavelength. And what we can see that it's important is that we have now a linear trend while we are changing our threshold, let's say, in comparison to the critical backlink wavelength, which is something that we didn't expect, like we didn't know, but it's very interesting to see that we get it. And then we see that for LP star with m equal 1, and I will explain what it is, our data falls exactly on top of this theoretical limit. So LP star with m equal 1 means that we are defining the cutoff, like the distance between defects in the inflection points of the Gaussian dimple. So we have the Gaussian dipole, and when the curvature is changing, this is actually the length scale that really defines our interaction regime in our data in comparison to the theoretical limit. So from now on, when I'm using this threshold, I'm using this LP star with m equal 1. And then we are doing like a more systematic study for the different parameters we have examined before. So we have now normalized our length scale LP star divided by the critical buckling wavelength versus the amplitude. And we see that all the data fall on top of this dashed line, which means that we are able to define a threshold which is exactly related to this theoretical value. And then when we change the width now, so same vertical axis in which are changing the width, we could see that until lambda equal 2.5, we have a very good agreement between the results. But then when the defects start forming one bigger dimple, we see that the story is a little bit different here. And now we want to do exactly the same study for different defects and see if there is any different behavior that happens if we change the amplitude and how this is related to our interaction regime threshold. And we could see that similar case as before, when we change the amplitude, the interaction regime threshold is quite constant. But then the story is a little bit different here if we have two different defects, because you could see that we could have some curves where we have this non-monotonic behavior, minimum, maximum, and then plateau. But here the maximum is not that pronounced as it was before. So here it's actually a bigger indication that the most critical defect is the one that drives the whole behavior of and governs the whole buckling behavior. And then once again here we could see that if we plot our interaction regime threshold versus the width, we could see that beyond the threshold width, where the defects now form a very distorted shape, we have some discrepancies, but then we are able to capture very well the cases where we have two independent defects. And this is actually, the work that we have as a follow-up, studying a little bit further the interactions. And now what's left? And this is my ongoing work that I have one more slide and we should be done fast, I think. So what we want to see right now is that what's happening when the strongest defect governs the behavior. So the idea that we have now, and this is what I'm working on, is that we go back to the case that we have multiple defects. So let's say we have 80 here. Then we systematically remove defects from the strongest to the less strong. So 0, 10, 20, 25% until we have like 90% of defects removed. And then the question we want to ask, which is very related to a work in the 1967, is like I showed you also in the introduction that work, is like, do the shells become stronger if I systematically start removing bigger defects? And that will confirm as well that the deepest one, like the most critical one, governs the behavior. And then something that is really in progress is like we are going to try, and we are trying to find like an equation to be able to predict the knockdown factor by only knowing the maximum amplitude of these defects. And some first results that I can share with you before I plot the knockdown factor, I have plotted here the PDF versus the amplitude in order to show you a little bit how we sample defects and how we remove them. So here, for example, the mean amplitude is equal to 0.5, and we see that we have our PDF, and then when we remove defects from the strongest to the less strong, it means that we are cutting defects from the tails. So the stronger ones will be removed. And then some results that we have now, and we are expanding also this work, is that if we plot the mean knockdown factor right now, we see that as we remove defects, 0, 10, 20, all the way up to 90, we're able to actually increase quite a lot the knockdown factor when we have smaller amplitudes. And then systematically we have this increase when we remove strongest defects, but it's less pronounced when the amplitude is much bigger. And finally, this is the conclusions of this work. So the takeaway messages that I want us to get is that two things. Throughout the whole presentation, I was talking about interaction regime, and non-interaction regime. So we have the potential within the interaction regime to either decrease or increase the knockdown factor. And then outside of this interaction regime, the strongest defect governs. And then, and the most important thing that we showed is that we can treat cell buckling as a probabilistic phenomenon that can be described with extreme value statistics. And most importantly, that the input log normal distribution of defects led to a 3-parameter Weibull distribution, which was the original hypothesis from this work that was confirmed. And yeah, before I close my presentation, I want to thank my collaborators for this work, which was William, Dong, Arefe, Florian, and Pedro, my supervisor. And thank you everyone for your attention.